but I would like you to recognize Euglena as being the most animal-like of the algae. Okay, so the next big group of protists, we had algae, which are plant-like. The protozoans are the animal-like ones. So proto meaning the first, and zoa meaning animal. So first animals are the animal-like protists. They're all unicellular, they're all heterotrophic. They cannot make their own food, they have to consume food. And so these are many times part of the plankton. They're the floaters, but we call them zooplankton because they are animal-like. Okay, and in this group we do find some that are actually human pathogens, meaning that they can cause disease in humans. So instead of classifying them by pigment type, what color they are, these animal-like ones we're going to classify by how they move. And so they can either move by cilia or flagella or pseudopods. And we'll look at each one of those types of movement as we look at the different types of protozoans. Okay, so we're going to start with the amoeboids, and this group is named for the amoebas, but they move with what are called pseudopod, which are false feet. So on this diagram here, you can see that it's starting to stick out, push cytoplasm into that part of the cell, and push out what is called a pseudopod or a false foot, and that would mean that the organism would start to move in this direction. You notice that he's pushing out quite several pseudopods. What you will see in these organisms, because many of them live in fresh water, is they will have contractile vacuoles, and I'm going to show you, have you look at a video of contractile vacuoles. But basically, if they take in too much fresh water, they're going to blow up, because animal-like organisms just have a cell membrane, not a cell wall. And so they have to basically pump out when they get too much water so they don't blow up. So plain old amoebas live in water. They don't cause any kind of an issue. They're just part of that ecosystem. But Entamoeba histolytica is an example of one that's pathogenic. So this is what would cause amoebic dysentery, and this is where sometimes if you're in a foreign country, you want to be careful about drinking the water if it hasn't been sterilized, because there's a possibility that these amoebas will be in there, and that causes some major stomach issues. So I like this electron micrograph because it's showing that they can stick their pseudopods out in several directions where they can find a food item and then actually surround the food item with their pseudopods, and then that food will be inside the cell, and then they can put enzymes into that vacuole and digest it. Okay, so that process of surrounding a food item and bringing it into the cell, this is called phagocytosis. Okay, so I loaded one very short video here, but I also loaded a second one under amoeboid movement that I would like you to take a look at when you pull up your PowerPoint. So we do have a couple of other examples of amoeboids. That means that they would have the pseudopods. So the foraminiferans, what makes them different is they have a skeleton of calcium carbonate, so it's kind of like chalk. And that's basically when those shells fall to the ocean, that's making these big limestone deposits, which is what the White Cliffs of Dover are made out of. So in this diagram here, you can see that there is a calcium carbonate shell. It has holes in it, and these are little tiny skinny pseudopods sticking out from the holes. So they're skinnier than the other amoeba pseudopods because they have to poke through holes. Okay. So this is a picture of the White Cliffs of Dover. So as the ocean levels went down, all of those foraminiferan skeletons piled on top of each other actually made those cliffs. And so the other example of an amoeboid is a radiolarian, and it's very similar to the foraminiferans, except the cell wall is made out of silica, which we saw in the diatoms. And the same thing happens. The pseudopods have to kind of poke out through the holes in the silica walls. Okay, so we've talked about those that move by pseudopods. We've talked about the algae, which are photosynthetic organisms. So the second type of protozoan is the ciliate, which means they would be moving by cilia. So if we look at this diagram over here on the right, you see all these little tiny hairs on the outside of the organism. Those are cilia. So all those cilia waving will help that organism to move. Again, it lives in fresh water, so it's going to have a contractile vacuole to pump out water. And these are interesting organisms because they have two nuclei. They have a macronucleus and a micronucleus. You do not have to know the difference between the two, but in this case, they kind of split the duties. And so the macronucleus, meaning the little bit larger one, is associated with digestion, so making enzymes for digestion, and the micronucleus is associated with reproduction. So they kind of have they split up the duties of the DNA within the nucleus of the cell. So this video here is kind of a nice one for getting a good look at how the contractile vacuoles work. And then here, this diagram, I believe, is in your book. Let me see. It's on page 371 in the 4th edition, but it identifies the two nuclei and shows the cilia. I would be good if you knew that these organisms, ciliates, moved by cilia. Okay, and again, I've tried to put in a video where I can to help illustrate what these organisms look like and how they move. So make sure that you click on that video when you're going through and making your notes. Okay. So the third group within the protozoans is the zooflagellates, and zo meaning they're animal-like, and flagellate meaning that they move by a flagella, which is a lot longer than cilia. Okay, so there's a lot of them that are free-living that just live in water and they're part of the food chain, but there are some that are pathogenic, meaning that they cause disease. And there are some that are symbiotic, that live with another organism. So we're looking at an example of each. Now, I've told you for a lot of those green algae and these different organisms, don't worry about the scientific name. But because this is one that causes a disease that is kind of a problem, I would like you to at least recognize the genus name. So Trypanosoma is an example of a zooflagellate that causes a disease. It causes African sleeping sickness. And the way that you would catch this disease is that you would be bit by a vector that is carrying this organism. Okay, so the tsetse fly is the vector that carries the zooflagellate. I put a picture here because maybe that sounds kind of exotic, but it really looks like a fly. And then when it bites you, these organisms get into your blood. So in this diagram or this micrograph, the big blue things, those are red blood cells. And these little ribbon worms with a flagella, that's the trypanosome. In this electron micrograph, it's colored, so you can see the red blood cells, but it also gives you a pretty good idea of what these organisms look like. So this is a treatable disease, but you do just have to be careful that you catch it early, because it can lead to issues if it's not caught and treated. So we don't have tsetse flies in the United States of America, and so that would mean we really wouldn't have to worry about African sleeping sickness. But we do have the kissing bug, which carries a very similar zooflagellate and leads to Chagas disease. So it's not as bad as African sleeping sickness, but sometimes these kissing bugs are out in the woods, and sometimes if you go camping or something, it's a possibility that you could get bit by one. And a lot of times the reason it's called the kissing disease is that you will see a little bit of a breakout around your mouth area. Okay, so zooflagellate trypanosoma causes African sleeping sickness. That's one example. It's a pathogen, causes disease. We have a second example here, trichonympha. And this organism here is a symbiont. It lives inside the gut of a termite. So maybe you know that termites eat wood, and that's bad. because if you get them in your the frame of your house, you're going to have a lot of trouble. The problem is that termites can't actually digest wood, so they require the trichonymph, which lives inside of them, to break down the wood for them so that they can get their nutrition. So you can see in most of these pictures, I think, that they have lots of flagella, not just one. So the nucleus is up here on this particular one, but it has a whole bunch of flagellum. And you don't find them free living, you find them living within the gut of the termite. And then I put a couple of other examples just because maybe you've heard of Giardia, which causes backpackers' diarrhea. So if you're out hiking or camping and you drink out of a stream that's maybe not very clean, that might be where you would pick up that example of a zooflagellate. Trichomonas vaginalis is some of you may have had trichomoniasis, which basically is an infection of the vaginal cavity, and usually that's pretty easily treatable too, but that's caused by a zooflagellate. Okay, the last group of the protozoans is the sporozoans. And so this name comes from the fact that they kind of look like little spores, but this is the group of protozoans that do not move. So they are non-motile. They don't have cilia, they don't have flagella, they don't have pseudopods, but they do form these spores during their life cycle. There are big life cycle diagrams in your book, and I'm not going to make you memorize the life cycle of the sporozoan, but we mention these here because this is a pretty big one in terms of our planet. So Plasmodium vivax is the sporozoan that causes malaria. And malaria is one of the biggest killers of people in the world. Okay, there are treatments for it. None of them are perfect, and so because malaria or Plasmodium vivax is carried by a vector, which is a mosquito, one of the ways they try to prevent infection is making sure people don't have screen doors and so forth, that they sleep under a mosquito net to keep the mosquitoes from biting them, and that way they won't get that disease. So in this photograph here, these are all red blood cells, and you can see in some of them that they have that little spore-like in it. Here's one right here. So they actually get inside of the red blood cell. And that can cause problems with circulation. It can lead to anemia and fever and shivering. And if it's not treated, these cells are going to clog up in the brain and the heart, and you could die from it. But if it's treated, then you can recover. So like I said, there is a example of a life cycle, and I'm not worried that you know all the parts of the life cycle, but I would like you to know that it ends up in the blood and that it's carried by a mosquito. So kind of thinking about why we even talk about malaria, if we look at numbers, and again, you don't have to memorize these numbers, but how many cases of malaria are annually reported worldwide? 220 million every year. Okay, so that's a lot, and that's just the ones that are reported. There's probably quite a few that are not reported. How many people die annually? 600,000. And so that's a pretty big number too. And again, you don't have to know those numbers, but I like you to have that kind of thing for perspective. So one other example of a sporozoan, and I just pointed out here because we have seen this in the DFW area. It's been back several years now, but maybe you remember crypto in the news, caused by Cryptosporidium, which is a sporozoan. It lives in water, and it gets in the digestive system. And so they were having problems with it in public pools where kids were swimming, and maybe they weren't all potty trained, and things got in the pool, and that's how it spread. And so they had to be real careful about cleaning regimens and that kind of stuff to clean that up. Okay, so the last group of the protist kingdom are the fungus-like organisms, okay? And so we're going to look at water molds and then slime molds just briefly. So water molds will live in water. We call them water molds. They're saprotrophic. That's why they're fungus-like. And so they cause ick. I've looked and I can't find the scientific name for this, and that's probably fine with you guys, but that is that fungus-like water mold that can infect your fish, your freshwater fish in your aquarium, and it can kill them. So if you get something kind of hairy looking growing on your fish, it's probably ick. It's caused by a water mold, and you need to get them out because it's going to, all the spores are going to end up in the water, and it could infect your other fish too. The other historically important example is potato blight. And so if you've taken history class, in Ireland they had the large potato blight and they had the famine, and so many people were dependent on potatoes as a crop for how they made their money that they basically, many people died, many people actually emigrated from that country to another country because they lost their livelihood, and this was all caused by a water mold. So you have some other pictures. You can see that it can also infect some water insects like this water bug here, and then you can see the potato blight in that potato. So for the slime molds, also fungus-like, heterotrophic, but they actually take food in. So they're not saprotrophs. They don't digest from the outside, but they bring food in and digest it inside their bodies. I'm not so worried about the plasmodial stage, but it kind of looks like a slug. They produce spores. Many are this yellow color, but we do find purple ones and some other bright colored ones, but you see them kind of streaming across the forest floor. And so this video here has kind of a time lapse of the slime mold kind of moving across the forest floor. Okay, and then I put a couple more videos in right here, just showing you that within the slime mold cells, many times the cell walls between cells will be broken down, and you can actually see the cytoplasm moving back and forth within those cell walls, and that's kind of an interesting characteristic of the slime molds. Okay, so you do have kind of a sum it up picture at the end of the chapter, and you can see that we've broken the protists into 3 groups: plant-like, fungus-like, and animal-like. And then we have the groups, some of them based on pigments for the algae, pigment colors, and then some of them we've given other names too. The animal-like ones, now I did not use this term here. We just called these sporozoans. It's a little bit easier to remember, I think. And then we talked about slime molds and water molds.